non-democratic governments can be very, very destructive of their own people because there's no control necessarily over government. So in principle, I'm a Democrat, but in practice, you can see all of the difficulties of making this work. A democracy needs to have an informed public. A democracy needs to have a respectful dialogue or deliberation in the public, not shouting, not even worse, violence, not hidden influence. A democracy needs to prevent being taken over by powerful interests that use the democracy as a facade, as a pretense rather than real democracy. So some democracies work pretty well. Some in Europe work reasonably well. I would say the quality of the American democracy has declined tremendously during my lifetime. Maybe that's an illusion, but I feel that, and I can see even in the data that people had more confidence in government 60 years ago than they have today. And I look at that, and I've, of course, spent my whole life trying to understand that declining confidence in our government. And I find two factors that are at the core of this. One is that after World War II, the United States created a security state with the CIA and other institutions that were supposedly ensuring national security. But in fact, they really diminished democracy, because the first principle of the CIA is that it's secret and its actions are secret. And it does lots of things around the world that are not good, but they're secret. So this really undermined American democracy. And we don't have much public effect on foreign policy, for example, in the United States, because when it comes to foreign policy, really the president and a few other people make decisions on behalf of everybody without public debate or without control by any really democratic institutions, other than a vote once every few years. But that's not enough, because we go to war all the time against the interests of the American people. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I mentioned earlier is the big money in politics. Some countries restrict private campaign financing. In fact, most in Europe don't have a lot of corruption of the political system. But the United States, I regard as kind of legal corruption, legal in the sense that our Supreme Court said that companies can spend whatever they want on politics, no restriction, or few restrictions. And the result is our election cycle, say the 2024 election, will spend maybe $15 billion of campaign financing. Now, you don't get honest government with so much money changing hands. You get government that is purchased by the highest bidder. And this is why the confidence in democracy has declined so much.
You mentioned, of course, the power of big money. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the situation in Europe. I just believe because the economies are weaker, then there's not so much money as in the US, but the tendency is practically the same. You mentioned Joe Biden and, of course, then President Trump. Probably they'll meet in elections next year, probably. Do you see the crisis in leadership? Because when we look in the past, we see many strong leaders who were both from Europe, from the United States, who were able to offer some vision and lead a society, some of them even towards a peaceful society. We mentioned Willy Brandt, Olof Palme. We can also mention Ronald Reagan as a special type of American heritage as well. I would say there is a certain decline in these leadership qualities. Do you view it as well? Because in Europe, it's, I think, very visible.
Yes, I think the quality of the political leadership in the US and Europe is very weak right now in general. Speaking of the United States, we have two leading candidates, one of whom is 81 and can't find his way off the stage anymore. He happens to be our president. And the other one is a convicted, is multiply convicted, psychologically unstable person who now faces dozens of criminal counts right now in trials coming up. So maybe we'll have an octogenarian who should never be running, and a convicted felon running for the presidency. This is a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. How can we get there? There are some other candidates. I'm hoping that Robert Kennedy Jr. Proves himself as a highly capable candidate, and I like him. We were schoolmates, we're friends, and he comes from a great political tradition. In fact, his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was, in my view, the last great American president, because after that, well, we had some very nice and smart people, a few, not very many. Jimmy Carter was one. But we've had a lot of failed presidents and failed presidencies. So the quality of leadership is quite low. And in Europe, it's also really surprising to me how, when the United States makes such bad judgments, European leaders tend to follow along the US lead. And of course, I'm very unhappy about the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone's unhappy about it, but I have a view that's somewhat different from the mainstream view, which is, in my interpretation, the war in Ukraine was caused by the US wanting to expand NATO. And of course, many in Europe say, no, it's all Putin. He did this. But I know enough history, and I was present at enough events to know how much the US provoked this war through absolutely stupid policies. Because if you're smart, you don't push a military alliance right up against Russia's border. That's just not a wise thing to do. Russia's extremely sensitive to the military of the West encroaching on it because of how many times Russia's been invaded by the West. And especially when the United States politicians have so much hostility to Russia, which they do. They openly express the idea that Russia should be dismantled and many other things. Of course, Russia's going to see NATO expansion as a direct threat to national security, and it's not going to let it happen. So this is just an example of terrible policy, predictable disaster. But the US went along with it. Now, my point was, the Europeans knew better. I know, because many Europeans told me many times, oh, NATO expansion to Ukraine is very dangerous. But then they don't say it in public. And they don't say it in public because the United States would get mad at them. And, they're afraid of the US. They shouldn't be afraid of the US. Europe should have its own independent foreign policy, and it should understand its own interests. And the interests are not just following along the United States. So this is just a very important example of the weakness of the political leadership right now in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we see that here very well. So they're actually not able even to formulate the national interests. And I don't know if it's fear or simply they are not capable to understand what's going on. Maybe it's a combination of both. However, the consequences are really disastrous for the EU, both economically and politically, of course. You mentioned
one European political leader said to me a couple of years ago, "Oh, they don't take us seriously in Washington." And he said it even more colorfully, which I won't repeat exactly, but this was a leader of a major country. And my thought was, yeah, but you should not allow yourself to be treated that way. That's your fault. That's not America's fault. Yes, America's arrogant, but stand up for Europe. And this should be the approach, but it's not the approach.
What is the path to peace for the war in Ukraine? Is America still powerful enough to impose global order? The US has just 4.1% of the world's population, while BRICS countries have 41.5%. In this conversation with economist Jeffrey Sachs, we discuss the origins of the conflict in Ukraine and NATO enlargement, US-China relations, and the decline of US dominance. Jeffrey Sachs is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University and president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Sachs has been special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General. He was an economic advisor to Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and former president of the Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. Sachs was twice named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and received the Tang Prize in Sustainable Development, the Legion of Honor from France, and was co-recipient of the Blue Planet Prize. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome back to One Planet Podcast and the Creative Process.
Thank you for having me.
So help us understand the history of the war in Ukraine. How did we get here and how do we get out of it? And if the United States isn't the country to help broker that peace, what country is?
This conflict is actually decades in the making. It didn't just come out of a Russian invasion in 2022, as is often said in the Western mainstream media. The war is often defined as an unprovoked attack in 2022. Actually, the roots of this war go back to the end of the Soviet Union and to the geopolitics around that. In 1990, the US and Germany promised the Soviet government at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward if Gorbachev went ahead and disbanded the Soviet military alliance. In other words, there would be a deal that on the Soviet side, the military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact, would be ended, and on the Western side, NATO would not take advantage, and Germany would be reunified, but NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. The U.S. cheated on that because as soon as the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the policymakers in Washington, especially in the Pentagon and in the permanent state in the United States, immediately planned for the eastern expansion of NATO. And by 1992, Ukraine was already on the list that NATO would go that far. In fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a U.S. major geostrategist, wrote in 1997 the timeline for NATO expansion, including that Ukraine would become candidate between 2005 and 2010, which is exactly what happened. So this war started, in my opinion, because the United States could not accept a peace in which the military alliances of both sides of the Cold War would stand down. Well, many things happened over the 30 years between the early 1990s and today, but probably the highlights to mention are that in 2008, George W. Bush Jr. forced NATO, pushed NATO, but really pressed that NATO would announce that Ukraine would become a member. And that happened at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. The Russian leadership was furious. They had warned again and again, don't do that. We don't want your military right up against our 2,000-kilometer border with Ukraine. Then a Ukrainian president won the election in 2010 on the program of neutrality for Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych won the election based on the idea that Ukraine doesn't want to become the battlefield between 2 superpowers and called for neutrality which had been enshrined in the original Ukrainian Declaration of Independence, but then was abandoned by some of the NATO-oriented politicians of Ukraine later on. So in 2010, Yanukovych called for neutrality, but he was overthrown violently in early 2014 with the U.S. participation. So this was really a terrible escalation because the relatively pro-Russian president, but one who called for neutrality, which I think was the only safe course for Ukraine, was overthrown, and the United States played a significant role in that. People know about the famous tape of Victoria Nuland, who is now our Undersecretary of State. At the time, she was the Assistant Secretary of State, and she described who the U.S. would see as the next government 3 weeks before a violent overthrow. It's pretty ugly business, in my opinion. Well, in any event, the war started in February 2014. It escalated between 2014 and 2021. The attempt to end the fighting at the end of 2014 and early 2015 came in two agreements called the Minsk Agreements, in which the government of Ukraine agreed with the breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine that those regions would gain autonomy. And then the government of Ukraine failed to implement the Minsk II agreements, even though they were endorsed by the UN Security Council. So the diplomacy failed again. And when Biden came into office in 2021, rather than trying to de-escalate, he called for NATO enlargement and reinforced the U.S. push to expand eastward. Putin strongly pushed back. Biden pushed back. The U.S. signed several statements in 2021 confirming that NATO would enlarge. I think this was all absolutely irresponsible. Russia massed troops on its border and put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement on December 17th, 2021, based on no NATO enlargement. The Biden administration formally replied that it was not willing to negotiate over that issue in a response in January. Then Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022, making clear that it was the failure to reach an understanding on the NATO question that was central to Russia's action. 4 weeks later, Zelensky declared that Ukraine was accepting of neutrality. In other words, the initial Russian invasion brought Ukraine to the negotiating table. And during the second half of March, with the Turkish government being the mediators, Russia and Ukraine hammered out a peace agreement. Incredibly, the United States blocked it because the United States told the Ukrainian government, you fight on, because American policymakers had two ideas. One was that Ukraine should not be neutral, it should be a NATO country. And second, that the war would be won by some combination of Western armaments and financial sanctions. And so the U.S. ratcheted up the war. Putin said, no, we don't stand down, we fight, and mobilized hundreds of thousands of Russians in the summer of 2022. And since then, we've been on a path of military escalation. I resent the fact, as a citizen threatened by this, that Biden has not negotiated over NATO, and that Biden and Putin have not talked once, as far as we know, since February 24th, 2022. You know, when two sides are fighting, they need to talk and negotiate. But that's rejected. The hardliners in the United States, Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan, Biden, say, why negotiate? We just escalate. We'll defeat Russia. This is, in my view, utterly reckless and irresponsible. First, it leads to the destruction of Ukraine. And second, it risks the escalation to nuclear war. So I'm very unhappy about this, and I very much resent that the mainstream media, like the New York Times, repeats the falsehood all the time that this was an unprovoked action on February 24th, 2022, seemingly wanting us to be without any context or history to understand where this conflict came from and how it can end. And a newspaper like the New York Times has a responsibility to tell the truth, and they're not doing it.
Indeed, as citizens, we have the right. A country is not looking after, in the US, the prosperity of its own citizens, going out, conducting these irresponsible wars when we don't have time with other things, with the environment. Ironically, what seems to be behind it all is this insistence on a unipolar world, insistence on dominance. And while the US wants to hold on to its status as a reserve currency, it seems under those economic sanctions that US has also suffered, it might even be hastening, strengthening the currencies of other countries.
Well, the basic point is the U.S. has 4.1% of the world population, so how could it presume to be the world leader? The U.S. is a powerful country, it's a rich country, but it doesn't run the world, and it should not aspire to run the world. That's a kind of madness. And the U.S. ideology for a long time has been that the U.S. should run the world. It's, to my mind, unbelievable. But then again, I've spent most of my career outside the U.S. seeing the other 95.9% of the world. And I know that the other 95% of the world doesn't want the United States to run the world. It's not against the United States. It just says, let us have our own part of the world. We don't want you running the world. We don't want you deciding what our government is, who we are, how we rule ourselves. You're just one place. And this, the United States leaders don't understand. They're very arrogant. They're very ignorant because of the two big oceans. They're very unaware of the history of other parts of the world. And we end up with this arrogant and naive and dangerous foreign policy because there's no doubt the United States is rich and powerful, and it makes lots of weapon systems. And I'm 68 years old, and the United States has been at war almost every year of my life, from Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and Nicaragua and Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya and now Ukraine. Come on, give it a break. And the U.S. is also experiencing the reality that other places in the world are catching up on technology, indeed leading on technologies as well. And China's a very successful, very industrious, very hardworking society, which in the last 40 years has gone from poverty to a very significant world important economy. And the U.S. has a very hard time accepting that. The U.S. attitude, if you listen to congressmen who don't seem to know anything, is, if China's successful, it must be because they're cheating. What about because they're saving more than 40% of GDP, that the Chinese people have been engaging in a remarkable upgrading of education, hundreds of thousands of PhDs minted each year, massive scientific research programs. Come on, this is the truth. And so this arrogance is not allowing the truth to come through. But you mentioned one specific point, which is the role of the US dollar. Part of the US strength after World War II is, the U.S. was basically the only economy standing, and it was a technologically advanced, rich, large economy, the world's largest. And the dollar was really the only internationally usable currency for quite a long time. So the dollar system became the center of how you do international trade. When you trade in goods, they're denominated in dollars. When you buy the imports, you pay in dollars, meaning you use accounts in U.S. dollars, typically in the U.S. banking system. When the transaction is closed, it's closed through the so-called SWIFT interbank system. And so the U.S. has had what France long ago called an exorbitant privilege, that it could print a lot of money because the rest of the world was holding dollars, using dollars. The dollar was the basis of the world economy. That's changing now. And it's changing for three basic reasons. One is the share of the U.S. in the world economy is diminishing. So this means that the predominance of the U.S. is bound to diminish. The second is technologically, settlements are going to occur in all sorts of ways other than through U.S. banks. And so-called digital currencies, especially central bank digital currencies, will mean other ways to make settlements. We'll settle in renminbi when we buy in China, or settle in rubles or settle in rupees when trade is with India and so forth. So there will be multiple currencies. And then the third part, which is really a matter of a bad set of decision making, the US has militarized the dollar, meaning that usually you think about money, well, you have it, you can use it, you can spend it. But the United States has come to say, if we don't like you, you don't necessarily have access to your money anymore if it's in our banks. So the US froze the dollar holdings of Russia. The US has frozen the dollar holdings of Venezuela. The US froze the dollar holdings of Afghanistan. My advice to any government that's not getting along with the US government is be careful about your money, because the US might come in and freeze your money. And so countries are looking to hold their reserves in other ways now. Perfectly understandable. And I think that this is another part of the move to a multi-currency international system from a dollar-based international system.
And you mentioned the possibility of a reserve currency being the renminbi. And so there's other things that are not often reported about China. One, and I know that you've written about this as well, is that they're stepping in where America's policy of destabilizing and it's destructive. China, in some cases in the Middle East, is stepping in as a peacemaker, and it's less expensive if we can achieve peace.
Well, probably the most remarkable diplomatic achievement of recent years, I would say, is China brokering a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In the American idea, those two countries were implacable foes. They could never agree. And for the United States, Iran was the enemy and Saudi Arabia was the ally. But the whole idea of U.S. foreign policy is you bring countries under your authority as an ally of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, and you fight your enemies on the other side. But China has a different idea, which is that Saudi Arabia and Iran had no fundamental reasons for this dissension, but they have plenty of reasons for cooperation. For one thing, they're both being hard hit by climate change. They need to cooperate because the water crisis is quite severe. They're both hydrocarbon economies. They need an energy transformation, which is very profound. And so the Chinese facilitated a reconciliation between the two. I'm very happy about that reconciliation, by the way. The fighting between, the bitterness between Iran and Saudi Arabia divided Western Asia. It contributed to an absolutely devastating war in Yemen, in which the United States gave its military support that killed a lot of people. And it destabilized a region that needs a lot of economic transformation and technological upgrading and change. And so this agreement is really a big help for the whole region, not only for the two countries involved. And China gets a lot of credit, in my view, for having the wisdom to see that that was a conflict that could be solved, not just exacerbated. But the U.S. approach was always to push at it. Even when the U.S. made an agreement with Iran, the nuclear agreement called the JCPOA, the U.S. government walked away from it. And then it maintained sanctions on Iran because the U.S. is not really serious at making peace most of the time. It's got an us versus them mentality. And I find that very destructive and not in the U.S. interest.
Yes, and I hope that China maintains this sensible approach because it's dangerous what's happening now in Taiwan. And just help us understand the situation, like in that through line between these proxy wars and what could happen in China.
Well, the situation in Taiwan is like the situation in Ukraine, very explosive, very dangerous, and requires cool heads to avoid a conflict. The fact of the matter is that actually all three governments, let me say, the United States, Taiwan, and China, have a policy that there's one China. And whether it is the government in Taiwan or the government in Beijing, they both say there's one China. They disagree on what happened in 1949 and how China should be governed, but they don't say there are two countries. And the United States, when it established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, very clearly said that there is one China and has one China policy. And that is how to keep peace and to make sure that this tension between Beijing and Taipei does not boil over to open conflict. But the United States started to play games with this. It started to form a military alliance with Taiwan, in effect, which is really coming into a military alliance in the middle of one country. And this is an extremely dangerous and imprudent thing to do. And Biden starts talking about how we're going to defend Taiwan, and the American politicians talk about how a war is coming. It's all utterly reckless, irresponsible. And what we should have is trying to reduce tensions, diffuse tensions through negotiation, through talk, through peace-building ideas, rather than stoking the idea that some conflict is inevitable. A conflict would be devastating, of course, first and foremost for Taiwan, but actually for the whole world. And so this needs to be avoided, and we need cool heads, and we shouldn't have American politicians saber-rattling. We should not have Speaker Nancy Pelosi fly to Taiwan after the Chinese government has repeatedly said, don't do that, don't provoke, don't stir up things. Don't make conflicts where there don't have to be conflicts. But the United States leadership doesn't listen very well. It's the same thing that when Putin said many, many, many times, do not expand NATO to Ukraine. The United States, oh, sorry, we don't hear you. You have nothing to say about that. That's none of your business. And then war comes. This is very typical of American foreign policy because American foreign policy leaders are too arrogant and they don't listen.
Yes, and now 61 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you'd think we learned our lesson. And of course, America would never accept a military alliance on its doorstep, say coming down from Canada or something like that.
Well, of course, when Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union in 1960, the U.S. idea was invade. That's it. It didn't say, oh, Mr. Castro, you can do what you want. It's an open door. If you want to be with Soviet Union, that's fine with us. No, it said, well, we invade. So that was 1961. In 1962, in the repercussions of that, and in a really reckless gamble and reckless action by the Soviet Union putting missiles into Cuba, this whole conflict escalated to just the brink of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in 1963, both President Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev said, we have to pull back from the brink. We have to live together. We should not be coming to the edge of global nuclear war. And they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in the summer of 1963, proving that even at the height of the Cold War, if the mindset is right, you can make peace. And that's the mindset that we need now.
Yes, it seems like the neocon mindset never really went away. Just help us understand, because to my mind, Ukraine is not indispensable for the US, right? It's just this idea of NATO enlargement. But there's other forces behind the scenes that are, profiting or pushing. And I understand that Zelensky, secured $110 billion in US aid and, of course, humanitarian, financial, military support. Also, like key partnerships with, the BlackRock venture capital firm, Goldman Sachs, to privatize Ukrainian assets. So that would then deepen the country's debt. So help us understand that a little, the path forward. How do we get out of this?
Well, when the debate raged initially in the 1990s about the wisdom or lack of wisdom of NATO enlargement, which was contrary to what we had promised and was not wise, a lobbying campaign took place in the United States led by the military-industrial complex. Very crude. That's how American politics works. Bring out the big bucks. So it was Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and other big companies became the lobbyists. And then, American congressmen, they salute money. They salute campaign contributions. They salute the lobbyists. And so this is how American politics works. There are always financial interests that are also playing a role here. So we have a mix of ideology, confusion, lack of historical sense, arrogance, and money all stirring the pot. It has very little to do with the American people, though. The American people are not asked about anything. The votes on money for Ukraine are generally almost secret because they're not really debated. They're just measures stuck into some other piece of legislation so that you never have to debate the fact that we've spent more than $100 $10 billion so far on Ukraine, and nobody's really been asked about it. Nothing of the American people haven't really been asked. So this is how American politics works. Now, what should be done? This war should end by the United States saying that NATO will not enlarge and Russia saying we take our troops home. That's the core of this. That was available in December 2021. It was available in March 2022, and it's still available now. It doesn't solve many, many other issues. What happens to the territories? What happens to Crimea? These are for negotiations, but the basic idea is that the two superpowers back off and that the war stops and that we go to political solutions, not military solutions. And that should be our priority.
And so finally, as you think about the future, the prospect of nuclear war, the kind of world that we're leaving the next generation, what would you like young people to know, preserve, and remember?
Young people should lead the way to a safer, cooperative, peaceful, and environmentally sustainable and fair world. This is the point. We need to build the future we want, not to feel trapped in this mindless cycle of violence and environmental destruction. The problems that we face are solvable, and they are not driven by the needs of the people. They're driven by greed or power seeking of elites. And we need to have a new generation say, this is not working. We want a world that is at peace, that is shared in prosperity, and that solves the environmental crises, which have become so deep and are neglected in part because we are wasting our time, our lives, our resources on these useless wars. The Republicans. Okay, then she stays, and then she's the point person for the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in February 2014 that starts this war, because people need to remember, just get on a website and look at it. Even they're admitting it. This war did start in 2022 with Russia's invasion. This war started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of the Ukraine government. And go listen to Nuland on tape several weeks before the overthrow, talking about who the next government would be in Ukraine. She's already plotting this with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, on a phone call that was intercepted. It's unbelievable. She was then Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Now she's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So she's that deep state, the one that transcends the political parties, that shows this is not Democrats and Republicans. This goes back to Cheney, to Bush. This goes to Obama administration. This goes right up to Biden. Come on. What is this? And we've known all along. Our own diplomats, William Burns, who in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, cabled home, and people can find it online because it was covered by WikiLeaks. They can find William Burns' email cable that says, my God, if we push NATO enlargement, this is absolutely a Russian red line. And the Russians have explained, don't do this, why this is so dangerous. And Nuland, okay, close your eyes, just go ahead, everything will be fine. And not everything's fine. Now we're in the middle of one war and at risk of another war, and nothing is fine.
Nothing is fine. I want to ask you, back at the debt, on the topic of the debt, there are those, Jeffrey Sachs, who say, you know what, we don't have to worry about the debt, so-called debt crisis, because our dollar is not backed by gold. We can just keep printing dollars. This is, I think, modern monetary theory. We can afford whatever we want. What would you say to them?
Well, it's technically right. What you do, technically, the Treasury borrows from the open market, and then the Federal Reserve buys that debt from the bondholder, puts money into the economy, and takes the debt back onto the books of the Fed. So it's no longer owed to the public. The debt is now owed to another unit of the government. But what happens is the money supply has gone up. So it is printing money
to finance the war. The problem with that is that, again, you can do it to an extent, but if you do it too much, you get inflation. And in 2021 and 2022, we had a blowout of the money supply. I've been a monetary economist for 43 years, I mentioned, international. I never saw it. In fact, it never happened before, such a large increase of the money supply. And then you start having inflation. The first inflation was that every crazy cryptocurrency soared in value, and then the stock market soared in value, and asset prices soared in value, and non-fungible tokens soared in value. But then it got into the commodities markets. Now it's getting into the real, you go to the grocery store, it's into the real economy. And so that's what happens when you print trillions of dollars, which is what we did in 2021, 2022. So you can do it. It's just that you have consequences when you do it. Don't do it and think you're going to get away with it just completely printing money. Lots of governments have tried that for actually a couple millennia. It's called debasing the currency. And you can do it for a little while, but after a while, you better pay your bills. That's the basic point.
Thank you. For those of you who just tuned in, I'm Marcy Winograd for Code Pink Radio. I am with the distinguished Jeffrey Sachs, economist, public policy analyst, who's been doing this for decades, talking about this debt crisis of anywhere from $24 trillion to $31 trillion, and the betrayal of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who promised that he would not deliver a blank check for military spending. And yet, all talk of cutting the military budget has suddenly evaporated during this period in which he is negotiating with President Biden and demanding cuts in Social Security and Medicare, food stamps, and so forth. Jeffrey Sachs.
I wish we heard Biden saying, well, at least we'll cut the military budget. I'm not hearing that either. Neither of them.
No. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's say you're in the White House. You're in the Oval Office.
Hard to believe.
I'm going to put you there right now. And you're meeting maybe with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and the Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and you say, look, this is out of control. This debt we have. We need to cut the military budget, slash it. What are you going to cut in that budget?
First thing I'm going to say, God, we thought we were going to bluff Putin and so forth, and just NATO enlargement was going to go on, and he called the bluff, and now we're in this ridiculous, horrible, tragic, destructive, expensive war. We're going to tell him, okay, no NATO enlargement, you go home. In other words, we're going to negotiate the end of this, which started with these provocations of overthrowing a neutral government and overthrowing the sanity of not moving NATO right up to a nearly 2,000-kilometer border with Russia and all that. So I would stop the war through negotiation. That would be the first thing. We'd save a lot of money. Second, I would say, look, we just had the accounting by SIPRI, which is the Stockholm Institute that keeps track of who spends what on the military. The United States is spending more than the next 10 countries combined. And I'm talking about China among those countries. We're spending 3 times China's military spending. We're spending more than the next 10 countries combined. Let's get this under control. Then I would point out that we have 800 military bases abroad. China, 1 or 2, depending on how you count, maybe a small one in Djibouti, maybe 1 or 2 others. We have 800. Okay, we don't need 800 for our security. It's not adding to our security, it's adding to our debt enormously. So let's get this under control. Let's take out an Excel spreadsheet also and do this right. Real numbers, not gimmicks. Let's see what we need to do in taxes, because God, there's so many loopholes here that it's unbelievable. But at the same time, let's stop waste on the, not just waste, tragic spending on the military industrial complex, because that is where we have wasted so much of our money.
Yes, and when we create, I don't like that word, has a positive connotation, but when we produce, or the military contractors who are really making a killing off of killing, when they produce new weapon systems, these systems emit tremendous greenhouse gases. So there is that connection. And too often we see environmentalists and peace activists operating in silos. And at Code Pink, we have a War is Not Green campaign because we think it's essential that we integrate these campaigns, because the military is a driver of the climate crisis. The Pentagon is the single largest global institutional emitter of greenhouse gases, consumer of oil and fossil fuels, and too much of that is under the radar. So let's talk about it. Now, let's also talk about what we're doing at Code Pink.
Great.
This week and next week. We have grassroots activists on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, Medea Benjamin, Olivia DiNucci, who many people met when she disrupted. Well, she's disrupted a few times those powers that be that insist on all of this never-ending spending for the military, including Joe Biden. So anyway, they're going to be on Capitol Hill with others, visiting key lawmakers' offices and saying, look, this is our petition. Code Pink is a partner in the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, which represents over 100 organizations. We have a petition calling on Biden, Putin, and Zelensky to support a ceasefire and peace negotiations now. And I thank you, Jeffrey Sachs, because you are one of the prominent signers of that petition, along with others such as Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Dr. Cornel West, Ann Wright, Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, even Roger Waters, the co-founder of Pink Floyd, has signed that, as well as Dennis Kucinich, one of my heroes, who was in Congress for many years and a great peace champion. So we are taking this ceasefire petition not only to offices on Capitol Hill, but also fanning out across the country to deliver it to congressional offices, along with a full-page ad that ran in the New York Times last week. Thank you very much, Eisenhower Media Network. And this ad said, let the United States be a force for peace in the world instead of, well, I'm adding this now, instead of a force for war and destruction. There are those, however, Jeffrey Sachs, there are those who disagree with this call for a ceasefire. They think it's controversial. They say, no, we cannot have a ceasefire because then Russia, Putin would end up with this annexed territory in the Donbass and in Crimea. Whether that was an annexation or reunification is certainly up for debate. What would you say to them?
I think it's really important to get to negotiations and to understand the roots of this war. This war came because we kept pushing NATO. And at the end of 2021, Putin put on the table, actually, you want to avoid war, here is a draft Russia-US security treaty. And it had several points, the most important of which is stop the NATO expansion. And you know what the White House said? No way we're going to talk to Russia about NATO expansion. That's our business. It has nothing to do with Russia. Of course it has to do with Russia. We're about to put NATO right up against the Russian border. And so this was calamitously misguided foreign policy in the United States. And it's not just me saying it. The leading American diplomats have been saying this for decades now. Don't do this. George Kennan, William Burns, who's our CIA director right now, warned about this in 2008. And William Perry, who was our Clinton's Secretary of Defense, nearly resigned over Clinton deciding to enlarge NATO because Perry was saying, we're going to start another Cold War with Russia. So it's possible to negotiate. But it's actually been, strangely enough, the United States that has absolutely rejected diplomacy. Americans probably couldn't believe that, but it's actually true. And it's at least two recent occasions. One is at the end of 2021, when Putin was putting a diplomatic initiative on the table. And we said, no, we're not going to talk about it. NATO enlargements, none of your business. That's what we told the Russians. And then at the start of the invasion, just a couple weeks after the invasion, Zelensky said, all right, okay, we could think about neutrality. We should negotiate. Now, I know what happened there because I've spoken to people that were deeply involved in this. Right at the beginning, the Ukrainians said, you know, we could really we don't have to be in NATO. We could have guarantees from other ways. And the Russians said, okay, let's talk. And the Turkish diplomats said, we'll mediate. And so real mediation started. And actually, the former prime minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, got into the act as an informal mediator. Towards the end of March 2022, they actually were working on the draft agreement to end the war. I'm talking about more than a year ago. And the United States said no. The United States said no diplomacy. Nobody questioned that in the mainstream media here, because when's the last time you read in the New York Times a real understanding of this war? It doesn't exist in the New York Times. They just want you to follow what the U.S. government says. And so if the U.S. government says it's all Russia, they don't want to negotiate, okay, then the New York Times will say it's all Russia, they don't want to negotiate. But for those of us who are there watching, seeing, talking, it's so different. We could negotiate this till today, and we're not even trying. And we're not trying because Victoria Nuland doesn't want to try. Every time this issue of negotiation comes up, she says, no, it's not the time. And actually, when General Milley said, this is the time for negotiation, it was, I think, it was the Undersecretary of State that said about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, no, he's wrong. This is not the time to negotiate. Come on, let's get serious. Well, Seymour Hersh's account and then discuss it. So they're not even covering the news and much less challenging a critical thought. And that,
yes, I would
that's
agree.
Pretty serious.
The New York Times, the Washington Post, and their coverage of what's happening in Ukraine have really assigned themselves to irrelevancy because they are Pentagon PR flacks who just repeat talking points. And there's no serious investigation into any aspect of this war. And that's why, at Code Pink, we support alternative non-corporate journalism. Please tell others. Code Pink Radio will tell you the truth. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's talk about China a little bit further. Yeah. China has come out with the 12-point peace proposal, which Biden immediately dismissed as, what did he say? He said it was irrational. Frankly, his response was irrational. Meanwhile, we've had actual Code Pink members have met with representatives of China in Washington, D.C. to thank the Chinese government for coming up with this peace plan and for playing a peacemaker's role. I mean, whatever people think about China and whatever criticisms they have, I think we have to be very clear that China, as you mentioned, has maybe one or two overseas bases. It's not a threat militarily, and it is trying to play the role of peacemaker, not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. Do you think that China, the global South, can make a difference here? I mean, because it's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Brazil, it's other countries too that are saying we need a ceasefire. We need it now because they know the security of not just Ukraine and Russia and the United States is at stake, but the security of the entire globe.
First, I think people should understand a basic fact about China. China has not engaged in one overseas war in the last 40 years, while the United States has been engaged in non-stop wars. We keep pointing our finger at China. Look at how militaristic. We vastly outspend China on the military. We have surrounded China with military bases. We've been engaged in constant wars. We are trying right now to break the Chinese economy. And then we point our finger like the G7 did in this recent meeting in just a kind of a hate-filled, ignorant session. Look at how evil China is. Look at how evil China is. It's so low level for anyone who really follows this. I was actually myself in China last month. I've been to China so many times over the last 40 years. We're in a propaganda field right now of anti-China propaganda that has no basis in reality. And we're trying to create an enemy there so we can crush China because they're daring to achieve economic development. So this is the starting point. Now, in terms of China's peace plan, it has one crucial point, and it says that a peace agreement should respect the security interests of all parties. What does that mean? That's code for don't expand NATO, because Russia, understandably, regards that as a direct security threat. To have NATO weapons on Russia's 1,900 kilometer border with Ukraine is not what Russia would like. Just like we would not be thrilled with Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada or any place else nearby. That's what Russia's trying to tell us. China gets it. China just uses very Confucian, if I could say, very nice, orderly words, respect the security interests of all parties. And that means to the United States, would you understand what Russia has been saying to the US since Russia was independent, December 1991? Don't enlarge NATO. And especially since 2008. My God, not to Georgia. Are you kidding? That's what they've been telling us. And China gets it. And that's why Biden immediately rejected it. Because this is a game. The game is Newland's game to expand NATO to Ukraine.
You know, I
Okay.
think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of, you know, beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, you know, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and by the way, if I may just,
weapons.
if I may just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, you know, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back, and now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas, he was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, yeah, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then letting, as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it, stop, don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this, NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in 2019,
but just
Ukraine
to say,
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really, really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, will you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean Georgia, the country in the Caucasus. Where's that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military-industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly,
Raytheon,
Jeffrey Sachs,
yes.
I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war? propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that BlackRock, representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, yes, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. This is the first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be. As Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend can be fatal. We are killing Ukraine. Literally, we're killing Ukrainians, but we're killing Ukraine. Think of how we loved Afghanistan, how we love South Vietnam. What do we do? Iraq. If you are the place where the U.S. is waging a proxy war, first of all, you will be physically destroyed. You will have mass outmigration of young people, of talented people, of people just trying to survive, for God's sake. You'll have your infrastructure destroyed. All of this, the Ukrainian economy is busted, and the Ukrainian population has shrunk tremendously because people have left the country. And so this is in no way helping Ukraine. This is just, I tried to tell the Ukrainians, I'm for you, I'm not against you. They kept thinking, oh, that's Putin propaganda. I said, no, listen, I go back to the Vietnam War in the United States, to Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when the U.S. grabs you in a proxy war. And this is what's happening right now to Ukraine. It's being tragically destroyed. And every time things don't work, our side ratchets up, and they keep ratcheting up. And sad to say, Obama knew in 2014, he got the main point when he said and realized that Russia has what's called escalatory dominance. What that means is Russia can meet us and raise the bet. Because for Russia, this is existential. For us, it's another war. Okay, we're going to expand NATO here. We're going to expand NATO there. We're going to do whatever we want to do. For Russia, they view this as the essence of Russia's national security. They have 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. Obama realized this, said, I don't want to even start down this path. I don't know what this administration is doing. They have no plan. It's phony. And phony in the sense that they have no route to success, but they're in it up to their necks right now. Worse than that, for Ukraine, they're in it above their heads. They're drowning in this violence. We've got to stop the fighting, because there is no military path to victory, because Russia can escalate, and can escalate to devastation. And we're told, oh, don't say that, don't mention nuclear weapons and so forth. You know what? Mention them. Understand.
Yes, and I think
I
think we should also mention, Jeffrey Sachs, that the United States has a nuclear posture review. The Biden administration says we will use nuclear weapons first if our allies' interests are threatened. So, who's going to use them first, or will they be used? All of this is speculation, but it's frightening that we are escalating right now, training Ukrainians on F-16 fighter jets that could
after they said again
Russia.
and again that they wouldn't do it, they keep taking the next step. it's time for the Newland administration really to step down so that we can have peace and have some sanity. In the world is diminished. There's no doubt that China is another option for countries. There's no doubt that most of the developing world does not want a US-led hegemony anyway, but it was living with one, or at least with the US intention of one. And the rise of China changes this fundamentally, because now the balance of power is much more dispersed. The BRICS countries have an output when measured in purchasing power prices that is even slightly larger than the G7 right now. Of course, the BRICS have many more people than the G7, so the per capita income in the G7 is much higher. But just the BRICS is a larger block, around 32% of world output compared to 31% of world output of the G7. US-China tensions have been rising since 2014, and my view is that the US security state already around 2015 began to push for measures to, in the American mindset, contain China. I think there was a change of mindset around that time in the American political and security leadership that said China's continued rise is no longer in America's interest. And a series of measures have been implemented since 2015 that really aim to hinder China's economy and, according to the US, hinder China's military capacity, but I think it's more general than that. And those measures include, of course, trying to establish a Trans-Pacific partnership that would exclude China. Rather extraordinary in my mind, almost laughable to make a Pacific Basin trading system designed to exclude China, as if somehow the Chinese economy wasn't there and the 1.4 billion people of China were not there. Of course, the US is constructing new alliances like AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US grouping to base nuclear submarines in Australia, ostensibly to police the South China Sea. The US has imposed technology barriers on China, financial barriers on China. The US has targeted leading Chinese enterprises like Huawei and ZTE. The US is going after TikTok, and now it's going after the cloud services of Alibaba and other major tech companies in China. So why is it doing this? In my view, it is mainly a misguided and a dangerous approach to try to maintain US predominance over China. I think that it is both wrongly directed and almost sure to fail, because China is a very successful society and successful economy with a lot of dynamism, with a lot of scientific and research capacity, with a lot of friends around the world. And the US idea of dominance is not very attractive to most of the world. Most of the world would like good relations with the US, but not a US that is dominant. I don't know of countries that are willing to make sacrifices for US dominance other than the close US allies. So when it comes to certainly Chile or Mercosur, Latin America more generally, or UNISUR, the goal for sure is to keep good, open trade relations and financial relations and technology relations with China, and to aim to do the same with the United States and with Europe.
I don't think that there is any remotely sensible policy other than the South American countries saying, of course we trade with China normally, of course we're partners with China, but we're also partners with the US and Europe, and we see absolutely no reason to choose sides, and we don't want to be pushed to choose sides. I personally see nothing nefarious in any of China's initiatives, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or others, and I don't believe the Western press, which I regard as mostly propaganda, that the Belt and Road Initiative is a debt trap or Chinese companies are especially harmful to host countries and so forth. So I don't view this as a complicated question, actually, in its substance. I see the U.S. changed its attitude. And when I say the U.S., I mean the security establishment, which runs the U.S. government foreign policy, changed its attitude to China 8 years ago. I do not believe that China provoked that. I don't think it was in response to hostile action from China. I think it was in response to China's success rather than to hostility from China. So I would encourage Chile and Latin America to keep open trade. Every day I say in the United States, maintain relations with China, stop trying to provoke a conflict over Taiwan, stop sending arms to Taiwan. Don't do in Taiwan what we did in Ukraine, which was to create the provocations that led to war, because I also believe that the Ukraine war was caused by US provocations, not by Russian imperial design. Of course, most American leaders violently disagree with me, or maybe not violently, but strongly disagree with me, but I'm old enough that I understand them at this point after almost 50 years of watching US foreign policy, and I think they're wrong, and I think they're provocative. And I don't want them to do the same thing in Taiwan that they've done in Ukraine, which is pump in a lot of arms and then express surprise when a war starts. But that's a possibility that would be a terrible possibility. I believe the US sanction regimes in general are illegal. I do not abide by unilateral coercive measures. My understanding of international law, as reflected in annual votes by the UN General Assembly, is that such sanctions policies are not valid unless adopted by the UN. So I would hope that Latin America would not get trapped in sanctions regimes, but basically would also take the position that nobody can sanction Chile's trade with China. And by the way, Chile's trade with Russia or others, though it's not as important, because if there are to be such sanctions, they're only valid if they're undertaken under the UN Charter, essentially by the UN Security Council. So that's my general view. And my general belief is that trade between South America and China should be strong, and I think it will be mutually beneficial. Latin America, of course, has a resource base which is very complementary to China's. China likes wonderful wine, great fruits, minerals, many wonderful things that Chile specializes in producing. It needs those things, and I think that it will trade and help enrich Chile doing so. At the same time, China has some excellent low-cost infrastructure technologies that I think can be a very great benefit for South America in terms of rolling out 5G, in terms of an integrated zero-carbon power system. China is very good at long-distance direct current high voltage transmission. To build an integrated South America-wide zero carbon power system, which Chile could be a very important energy provider to such a system. And so I see many complementarities that are very strong, and hope that Latin America's and South America's trade, finance, diplomatic relations with China remain strong and dynamic. Maybe I'll just stop at that point.
Has been raised by the New York Times in its editorials, in its opinion columns of the New York Times columnists like Tom Friedman and others, and in the invited op-eds. And you just can't get a word in otherwise. You can't tell that readership you were just describing in Manhattan, where I happen to live, what's really going on. So this is the frightening part. And we're also told, Glenn, which is pretty damn weird, don't worry about nuclear escalation. Don't be blackmailed by this. My advice is worry, and worry a lot. And if you have been around these issues for a while, and I have for decades, and I wrote a book about the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's successful quest to negotiate a partial nuclear test ban treaty with Nikita Khrushchev, you know, if you're not worried, you just don't get it, because you better be worried. And I'm very worried about this administration not getting it.
You know, it was such a staple of Cold War culture, Cold War policy, that avoiding nuclear war was the single greatest priority as we were going around the world with these proxy conflicts against the Soviet Union. We managed never to directly engage them militarily. And even then, misperception, miscommunication did bring the world close to nuclear annihilation, at least on 2 occasions, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And yet it really does amaze me that we seem to have just kind of, through, I don't know, inertia or lethargy or historical ignorance, come to view the risk of nuclear war as basically a fiction, as kind of assigning zero value to it, or even this kind of macho attitude that we're not going to be deterred by a country having nuclear weapons. Talk a little bit about, you know, in the time that you've been working in all the things that I discussed in these kind of geopolitical framework, even from an economics perspective, the specter of nuclear war and how it used to be kind of important for people and policymakers in deciding what they would and wouldn't do.
You know, there was one moment when Biden was caught on tape saying, you know, we're on a path to Armageddon. This is, I think it was the fall of 2021, if I remember.
No, 2022.
2022,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
I'm sorry, 2022, excuse me. And, you know, he was excoriated by the press the next day, rather than anybody reflecting, oh, my God, the president of the United States is saying this. He was excoriated. How dare he say this? You know, he let a tiny glimmer of the truth in. And then, of course, the whole idea was shut that up. Don't talk about that. Well, anyone that knows some history, and by the way, if you want to know some history, the most wonderful book written about this by a great historian is a book called Gambling with Armageddon by a late, great historian, Martin Sherwin, who wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the whole atomic age, in fact. And the book is terrifying because we came so close 60 years ago, actually 61 years ago now, to nuclear annihilation. And almost every one of Kennedy's aides would have pushed us to that. We fortunately had a president who had the sense to avoid the ultimate disaster, but almost none of his aides had that sense. And what Sherwin recalls, and what we've learned from Dan Ellsberg and from so many others, is how close we've come and how easy it is to come close, because there's so many stupid people in our government. Believe me, this is something I can tell you absolutely. People who don't think, who are extraordinarily lacking in basic common sense, who believe that power is the only coin of the realm, who believe you really do have to be tough on whatever it is, and
nuclear war will see them down. And all of this is extraordinarily reckless, and we're really in it now. And it's, of course, not just Ukraine. It's Nancy Pelosi flying to Taiwan. It's us doing whatever we can to humiliate China. It's having an absurd G7 meeting last week in Hiroshima, of all places, that the U.S., of course, bombed with the first nuclear atomic bomb, spending the whole G7, in essence, to attack China and Russia. They think it plays politics. They think it's a game. It's extraordinarily reckless and extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily predictable what's going on.
Yeah.
Because the real diplomats inside the U.S. have been warning about this for decades. We're only finding some of it out by WikiLeaks and by disclosures such as Bill Burns, their CIA director, who was in 2008 the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he sent a memo that everybody should read.
For Condoleezza Rice.
2008, yeah, he explained, my God, this NATO enlargement business is absolutely dangerous. And of course, George Kennan, a decade earlier, and George Kennan was absolutely brilliant and understood already in the 50s how we could have gotten out of the Cold War. But certainly in 1997, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, when they still ran such op-eds, that this whole NATO enlargement business was absolutely reckless. And what's interesting, when Kennan was writing that in 1997, I hadn't actually realized it until I went back and saw a reference to an article in Foreign Affairs by Zbig Brzezinski that I didn't remember, writing in 1997, laying out almost the precise timetable for how we were going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. Now, this is years before Putin's president. This is when we're not having any war with Russia. People tell me, oh, yeah, well, they have to be in NATO. Look at Putin, madman. But this is well before, and Brzezinski lays out, basically to the year, the sequence of how it's going to be the first row of countries, which was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. Then it's going to be the next row. Then Ukraine by 2005 to 2010, he writes, they're going to have their invitation. It turned out to be 2008. Our ambassador to NATO in 2008 was none other than Victoria Nuland. If you want to know what deep state means, she's been in every administration. She's been almost every night.
Except when Trump was elected. That's the only way, apparently, to get her out of the government.
Except Trump.
Yeah.
So she was Cheney's advisor. She was ambassador to NATO when we asked Ukraine to come in. She was the point person on the U.S. engagement in the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, which started the war in Ukraine. And she is now promoted for all of this, bringing us ever closer to disaster. And by the way, putting Ukraine in the classic place in a proxy war guaranteed to destroy that country, which is exactly what it's doing.
You know, the thing that struck me so much about that Bill Burns memo in 2008, when he was warning Condoleezza Rice and others in the Bush administration about the insanity of this plan, was he said, it isn't just Putin. You go and talk to every single person of influence in Moscow, even Putin's liberal critics, and it's all, for every last one of them, a huge red line to be mucking around in Ukraine for the West, in part because of the history of the 20th century. And that's what I wanted to ask you. You gave this interview in February of 2023 with Isaac Chadner of The New Yorker, who has become this hero to the liberal establishment because of these adversarial interviews he purportedly does. A lot of it is based on how transcripts get edited, how much he gets to say, how much the guest gets to say. I've done a couple of those with him, so I know firsthand. One of the points
what a low life approach to journalism. By the way.
Completely. I mean, mine I felt ended up being pretty fair, but I've seen him done incredible hatchet jobs with others, including yours, because one of the points you kept trying to make was that the premises of his questions, embedded in them, they were almost like, when did you stop beating your wife questions, were so misguided because he was distorting the history of the conflict, in part by thinking the war began either in 2022 or even in 2014 with Crimea, and you kept pointing it out, actually the start of the war is 2013 with this change of government that he was shocked you called a coup, or even before with NATO expansion, even before it got to Ukraine. So talk about those parts of the history that the New York Times, the New Yorker editors didn't allow you to have included in that article, and why you think that history is so important to understanding how we're being propagandized about the conflict now.
Well, it's a little amazing to be the New Yorker of all places. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say of all places, but Remnick's New Yorker is absolutely neocon, beginning to end. The New York Times is completely neocon. I don't know if they would be, by the way, if I can't figure it out if it's just anti-Trump, pro-Biden, or they really believe the stuff that they say, but they're absolutely unwilling to listen or to learn a fact. The thing that surprised me about Chotiner was just how he knew nothing and kept making aggressive assertions. And when you tried to say something, it was just snark. So it was a really weird experience.
Well, he's playing to that audience that loves it. Like, you know, they assume all of his assumptions that he's getting from the New York Times. That's the full extent of their worldview. You kept trying to inject an alternative historical understanding, but it never made it into the article, which is why I'd love for you to offer it now about the importance of 2013 and that change of government, and even kind of going back to when NATO started expanding after the reunification of Germany eastward toward the Soviet or toward Russia.
Well, you know, I posted a piece on Common Dreams, which people can take a look at to get a lot of the hyperlinks and a lot of the underlying data and evidence. But this story really goes back 34 years. It goes back to 1989, 1990. The U.S. and Germany were both very clear to Gorbachev, who was a godsend for the world, by the way, because he really was a man of peace, and I was profoundly honored to try to help him on the economic side, though the White House was having none of it at the time. But in any event, Gorbachev believed in peace, and he unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet side NATO, and Baker and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, repeated time and again to Gorbachev, and in many, many different forms, and so did the NATO Secretary General and others, we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. We won't do it. Now, I spoke to a wonderful historian who is working on this right now, who tells me that in the archives he's come across in 1992, not only the plans for NATO expansion, but Ukraine already on the list for NATO expansion in 1992, when supposedly in the public there is no such thing as NATO expansion at all. But remember 1992, that was Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld in the Bush senior administration. I thought, what could be worse? Well, we kept learning things can get worse.
Right.
Even in the Democratic Party, the love affair with the so-called liberal hegemony. I don't know what the liberal part is, but I know what the hegemony part is. That has been Nuland's thing, and of course her husband Robert Kagan's thing for decades. This has been underway since the early 1990s. Now, the Russians have been saying, and Gorbachev said, don't move eastward. We want peace. We want openness. I was actually advisor to Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to Yeltsin. I was economic advisor to Leonid Kuchma, first president of independent Ukraine. I've seen all of these people. You know what they wanted? They wanted normal life. They wanted to stop the Cold War. They did not want crazy things. They wanted normalcy. And we wouldn't give it. What we said, normalcy, yeah, that's U.S. hegemony. That's U.S. indispensable power. That's U.S. we do what we want anywhere we want when we want it. And that has been the story all along. And frankly, I couldn't imagine it at the time because I was watching with my own eyes as a young guy. Suddenly, the world had a chance for peace. And peace didn't mean U.S. global hegemony. Peace meant normal cooperation, but we couldn't accept the deal of just being normal and cooperative. We had to say, now we lead on everything. And that's been the story since the beginning. Now, there are many steps to it. Clinton was the first violator of the promises, and Clinton's so inconsistent on everything, but this is one of the things he was inconsistent on. So the first NATO expansion took place under Clinton, and that was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. The next NATO expansion, 7 countries by Bush Jr. in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania and Bulgaria on the Black Sea. So you had the Baltic states, you had Romania and Bulgaria. You're starting to, right up against Russia, Slovakia and Slovenia. Now, Putin says in 2007, stop already, stop. He says it in a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. We don't listen at all. 2008, Bush says NATO is going to enlarge to Ukraine. The European leaders, by the way, were aghast. And one of the European top leaders at the time called me, said, what is your president doing? Of course, European leaders don't say any of this publicly, but they say privately, this is crazy. This is so dangerous. But of course, they were quiet. Bush pushed this through in 2008. Then there was a reprieve for Ukraine. The reprieve was that the president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, look, we're in between 2 giants. We don't want to be smashed in the middle. We take neutrality. But neutrality was a red flag for Victoria Nuland and her friends. And so at the end of 2013, when demonstrations against the decision that Yanukovych had made to postpone signing an agreement with EU started protests, believe me, the U.S. covertly and overtly and every other way stirred that up massively. But in January and February 2014, they supported a violent insurrection that overthrew Yanukovych. And of course, notoriously, Nuland was caught on tape, something we don't talk about, but anyone go listen to it.
She picked the next leader. She picked the new leader.
She's planning the government weeks before the overthrow, calling exactly who would be the prime minister, by the way. It's amazing. But the whole thing is amnesia. Don't talk about any of this, though it's so obvious. And I had a weird experience personally, which was that when the government was overthrown and Yanukovych fled and Yatsenyuk was prime minister, just as Nuland said, I got a call. Yatsenyuk wants to meet you. It's a deep economic crisis. Okay, I actually respond to those things when a government says we're in a very deep financial crisis. So I flew to Kiev. And I had an NGO brag to me about the role they played in the overthrow. And it was ugly. It left me shaking. It was, the kind of thing you just want to wash that off. Don't tell me this awful stuff. You had no business being part of a violent insurrection. But that's the role we played. I went home. I didn't go back. I was disgusted by the whole thing. But it was obvious then we were on a path towards war. This didn't start with a, quote, unprovoked invasion February 24th, 2021, 22, excuse me. This started in February 2014. And it started with the US participation in a coup.